Hello there and welcome to the Star Wars Showcase YouTube channel, where this time around we are looking at the next installment of our Black Series 10-year look back, with our attention turned this time around to the Blue Line. Now, our Blue Line figures were originally released in 2014 and 2015, and all of these figures bear a lot of similarity to our original Orange Line releases. However, there are a couple of things that I think make these figures unique, both in terms of the pros and the cons. So the idea here today, again, is to take a look at the good, the bad, and the ugly as part of this 10-year look back. Now we're going to start with the cons here and slowly build our way to the pros of the Blue Line, because if you take a look at this image here, you'll notice that quite a few of these figures are either direct repacks from the Orange Line, or you can already see this idea of repaints kind of leaking into the new releases. We've got a Blue Line Sand Trooper who's exactly the same as that Orange Line release, albeit with some small paint differences on the pauldron. We're already seeing different Clone Troopers with just some slight paint modification, as well as some of our new figure releases, figures like, Commander Cody, for instance, who are just that basic Clone Trooper with a couple of new parts. And in looking back, to the very beginning of the line, this is the first 2-3 years of the Black Series, I think it's important for us to recognize that these repaints and these repacks, these have been a part of the Black Series from its very inception, and aren't necessarily a bad thing, as any new action figure line that's out there trying to get its feet under it might not have the budget to create, dozens and dozens of new sculpts and individual figures. And so we see here, even at the very beginning, that we have to kind of get creative in terms of reusing the assets that we've already got, while still working as much as we can to get new releases and to get new products out there. And I think that leads into one of the pros here. As we see, the line first getting started, we do have a couple of repeats on the Clone Troopers, on the Stormtroopers. Even the Stormtrooper Han and Luke are just, your average trooper with that new head sculpt on there. But in terms of the pros for the Blue Line, we already start to see some really unique variety come out in terms of the other releases. Figures like Bosk and IG-88. I mean, honestly, these are kind of deep-cut figures who only get a couple of seconds of screen time, but who are already getting their own unique releases, where, especially for a character like Bosk, it's hard to reuse that. We've only got so many, dinosaur bounty hunters out there, and so Bosk is kind of a one-time sculpt for a one-time release. In addition to our bounty hunters, we get a chance at our first Darth Vader, we get a chance at our first Emperor Palpatine, and I think that's something for us to recognize, is that for any of these action figure lines, there's going to be a healthy balance of this. There's going to be your repacks and repaints, and in the long run, the savings that companies are able to realize through those sorts of releases can be dedicated to new figure sculpts and new releases like these. And I think 10 years later, as we start to look at the releases that we're getting here in 2023, we're still seeing that balance in place, as a lot of your big box store exclusives are often these repaints of different troopers or a mix and reuse of previous assets, while our mainline releases are pretty consistently brand new figures from top to bottom. And I know we'd all love if every single one of the Black Series releases could be this brand new figure where, every single part is individually molded for 100% accuracy. But sadly, that can't always be the case. And it's something that's been true since the very start of this line. And so I think we see a pretty good balance struck here within the Blue Line. And it's a balance that we continue to see through the rest of Black Series releases leading up to the present day. Now, when it comes to the ugly, as we're looking at the Blue Line, I think something that we need to call out is these are older figures, some of which are almost 10 years old. And I think there's a certain amount of perspective we need to take when judging, how well put together they are, or how good the articulation or the face printing is, because much of that technology is going to evolve here over the next several years. I think the one thing that we do need to call out, though, is that many of these more outdated sculpts and features are still being incorporated into the line today. we see for more recent releases things like for instance, our Inferno agent. Here I've put together this custom Iden Versio, but this figure is still reusing assets from that original TIE Pilot release back in like 2013, 2014. Another example of this is the recently released IG-10 figure. So made his appearance in the first season of The Mandalorian, and because the droid bears such a resemblance to IG-88, they reused most of the assets. But that older IG-88 figure suffers from a lot of weaknesses of the time, where the articulation isn't great. It's subject to this warping on kind of the legs and the knees. And the little rubber pieces that cover the elbow really kind of fade and crumble, literally, with time when you're putting any amount of articulation on those elbows. And so even though we are getting some of these more modern figures for these more modern characters, oftentimes they're bogged down with the same weaknesses of these older, more outdated releases. And we're seeing a lot of that really heavily within the Archive line. Now, I'm a huge fan of the Archive line. The idea here is that we are going to re-release these older figures for either newer collectors or collectors who missed those original releases. And considering I really started collecting heavily in 2015, this was a great way for me to collect a lot of the characters and figures from those original orange and blue lines. But the problem is we're still getting, most often, the same exact sculpts from those original figures in these re-releases. And therefore, we're seeing a lot of the same weaknesses even in products that are being released, beyond 2020. So, for instance, this new Obi-Wan Kenobi, the guy can barely hold his lightsaber. He certainly can't hold it well with two hands, or strike any, of those famous kind of Kenobi poses. Or for another example, you could look at Commander Cody, who was a great release back in the day, but when you're now comparing it to the new Clone Trooper releases, you're seeing a lot of weaknesses in terms of, the legs warping. The figure always kind of looks like it's riding a horse, just due to kind of the bow shape of those older legs. And I guess just within the line, we've seen a lot of improvements made. And as we kind of double back on many of these, these blue line and these orange line releases, we're just bringing a lot of those older weaknesses back up to the forefront when we've made a lot of great advances. And so the blue line has its strengths, it has its weaknesses, and I think many of these are continuing to echo and ripple into the way our Black Series figures are released today. At the same time, I think the blue line is continuing to set the foundation that as we transition into our red line releases, I think we really start to see this line take off, where we're getting, waves with 4, 5, 6 brand new sculpts. We're starting to see a lot of the improvements in terms of our photoreal technology. I think it all really starts to come together here following 2015, the release of The Force Awakens, and really the full expansion of this line from kind of a niche kind of offshoot to really being a direct competitor to more traditional Star Wars releases like the Vintage Collection. So, let me know your thoughts here on this kind of look back and retrospective of the blue line. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have any favorite figures or ones that you just really can't stand? Let me know in the comments below.